Welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast. We're here to show you how practical psychology can be useful and make your workplace better. I'm Dr. Ernest Wayde, and my guest today is business psychologist and a social scientist who specializes in the tech sector. So right there, you've got three of my favorite things: business, psychology, and technology, and she does a really great job interacting and integrating these things. Her name is Dr. Jena Booher. Jena is widely recognized as a strategic advisor to startups nationwide. She specializes in industries like commercial real estate, retail marketing, and digital health and wellness. Jena is currently the founder of JEM Advisors Group. But really interesting about Jena is she used to work as a sales trader at JP Morgan. Wow, Jena, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dr. Wayde. Appreciate you having me.
Jena, please call me Ernest. Jena, you have such an interesting story. I really want you to tell us about your journey. How'd you end up where you are working with psychology, business, and tech?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Jena Booher. I'm a business psychologist. I specialize in tech within the New York City area. I have clients all over the globe. Really, my sweet spot is helping startups successfully move from startup into scale up. It's that messy middle transition where they've already determined product market fit, got a couple key customers, and they're really trying to scale and grow their organization. That is typically a really tough time for companies moving through that transition, and that's really where I play. But like you mentioned, I didn't start my career in psychology. I never took a psych class in undergrad. Would have a passion around human behavior ever since I was a little girl, but I went into banking. I started my career at JP Morgan at the height of the '08 recession. And through my experience there, it's just like, what is it like to be an employee? What is it like to work on a team? What is it like to have good bosses and bad bosses? What is it really like to work with difficult people or challenging clients? Like, it's really through experience firsthand and trying to proverbially climb the corporate ladder. And I did that for 9 years of my life. So it wasn't a short amount of time by any means. But while I was really excited about the opportunity of working at a big bank, there's a lot of prestige and a lot of cool things. I was never really passionate about financial markets, if I'm really honest. It's like a long time to stick with something when you don't really care about
9 years
working on. But those lessons that I learned in trading were invaluable and definitely help me with my work now. I know what it's like to work in competitive environments. I know what it's like to feel pressure of a down market. And what is it like to work with leaders that are just trying to figure things out? So that definitely informs the work that I do now. So after 9 years, I did make the pivot, and a very supportive husband who was just like, yeah, this isn't for you. Go find out what is. And I started a whole new career in my early 30s and took it and never really looked back. It took off.
Yeah, I think that's such a great story. And I was just saying before we started the show that it's somewhat similar to mine in that you had that experience, because I used to work in tech as well before I jumped into psychology full on. But I really appreciate all the things that you've done and the experience that you've had in your past. I want to dive right into the work that you do now, because I think you do so many interesting things, and I want to try to get through some of them. I want to start with the mergers and acquisition, because you talked about at the beginning of the show, you said, what is it like to be an employee? And that sense of what it's like to be an employee. Can you help us understand what it's like to be an employee in that setting when that's going on from either side of the business there?
Yeah. So M&A events can sound very exciting and dynamic. When you're in it as an employee, it's really hard.
And M&A is mergers and acquisitions, right?
Yes, mergers and acquisitions, yes. So one of the big thing that I work on is really the cultural integration of the organizations. And that's really only become a top priority for the venture cap world, for instance, even in just the last couple of years. This was kind of something no one really focused on or talked about. But McKinsey has a lot of data on this, and they have found that your revenue and cost synergy targets are more likely to be met when you do effectively manage cultural integration. And that is a priority from the onset. So we have a lot of data on this now, but
why is that important? Help us understand why that's important.
Yeah, sure. So especially when it comes to It actually really depends on the type of merger or acquisition. So some are harder than others. And when it comes to the employee, like your question earlier, like some can be felt pretty deeply by the employees depending on the type. So my experience, I've worked with in a lot of M&A events, the type that is typically the most intense, both from whether or not you're going to hit these revenue and cost targets and like your bottom line, all the way to the experience of the individual employee, is really when you have two equal size companies coming together versus a situation where a company is acquiring a much smaller company. But when it's a merger of equals, so to say, the differences are felt everywhere and it's quite unavoidable. And how you manage through that is everything.
Is that because that you have two equally sized companies that both have unique cultures?
Yeah, so so it depends. Some companies actually don't necessarily have strong cultures to begin with, which with that is its own interesting dynamic. But certainly, in my experience, the companies that I worked with and M&A events that I was working on, they both companies did have very strong heritage cultures, and they were very emotionally tied to them, the employees. How they were able to create an identity that was go forward, not look backward, was
Yeah.
the challenge at hand.
So how do you do that? How do you get employees, especially when you have that emotional attachment to your culture? It's part of the reason why you came to work there. And how do you transition from leaving that behind to finding a new culture that you can be comfortable with, that both organizations can be comfortable with?
Yeah, it's really hard. And we're in this field of like data and science. Like I would say this is an art more than a science, candidly, because you're working with emotions and feelings and stories that people have of the past, and
Yeah.
it's just really hard. But one of the things that there's a couple like low hanging fruit things that are easy to kind of chip at. One of the things that we did that was really helpful was we redid the entire company values. There's a bunch of different ways you can do that. I did a bottoms up process where I involved all 250 employees in the process. The project took 100 hours of my personal time. I wrote like a fun blog post on like how we did it, but that was it actually mattered much more the process that we ran rather than just the output and what the company came up with. Like the journey was even more critical in how we came to those new values. But that was like one thing that we did early on, because when I came into the org, the founders of both companies, they did realize that they had to redo the company values because the old values didn't make sense. They really had different philosophies of what they viewed as important in their old heritage organizations. But the problem was what they ended up doing was they took the values of each old company and kind of just created like a smushed up version.
Because that works really well.
And like everyone's smart, everyone like graduated like from top schools and did all the right things, and it just is like, but you're trying your best, like when you're in the middle of it and you're a
Yeah.
founder that's like just merged with, and at the time is actually their like enemy competitor.
Oof.
Like you're
That's a,
really
that's a
just
different layer there.
different layer there. You're really just trying really, really hard. And I have a lot of empathy for founders in that situation where it's like, yeah, hindsight's 2020. We can look back and be like, that was
Yeah.
dumb. Everyone's just trying their best. So, but these weren't company values that the organization really could buy in. And especially when it comes to like startups and tech, like values are important as opposed
Yeah.
to maybe like candidly, like I don't even know what the values were at JP Morgan. Could not tell you. That's like a different beast. But when you're in like a small startup, you want to have a very good idea of what does this company stand for and what do we not stand for.
Yeah, because a lot of people want to identify with the place that they're working at, especially when the organizations are smaller. That's part of the reason why people go there. I love the description there that you talked about in terms of starting from the bottom up. Usually you see it start from the top up. And so in talking about the process, it's really about getting people the opportunity to be heard, right? And less about the outcome. They feel like they've been heard. They feel like they've been part of creating this new organization, and so they're going to be more engaged and more invested. I love that approach. You mentioned the founders. When you're starting from the bottom up, how do you keep the founder engaged? How do you keep the founder, especially one of the founders that is, having to take maybe a lesser role in this merger? How do you keep them feeling like they still have ownership of this? And how does that work?
Yeah, and just to be clear, you're talking about the values or just more the whole integration process or both?
The values.
Yeah, so I'm laughing because I basically excluded them at the onset, really. And I've run this process multiple times at other companies. So when you're doing a bottoms up process, like you don't really want early on the founders' input.
Right.
It colors the whole experience, and then it like kind of insidiously signals to the organization that like they know better, founders know better, you don't know enough. So
Right.
where I did involve the founders was much later on in the process, where there was a coalescence of core themes, and then we had to get to like decision making. But I actually, it wasn't just them. Like there was a handful, I called them delegates, and there were a group of, there was over a dozen people at various state areas, different functions within the org. And the founders joined these delegate meetings to make the final decision. So they provided their input then, but there
Yeah.
was no like founder sign off or founder approval.
Okay. So they get a say, but it's not the overriding say, right? How does that work when you have more of an acquisition, where you have a founder or a leader who's been with the organization for a long time, and now they have to take a lesser role in that larger organization? How do you help them work through that human side of that, the behavioral side of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's super hard. I've had this experience multiple times happen. So there's a couple things that come to mind. So the first thing that comes to mind is oftentimes the founder in that situation, or at least in my experience, that founder often is a SME, subject matter expert.
Yep.
And if you can double down on making sure that that identity is well known and what their subject matter expertise truly is throughout the org, they find a home.
Okay.
So that's one. But they may not necessarily like run a function. So they may not be the CRO of the company they are being folded into. They may not be the chief product officer. They may not be like the person who has the nearly the most say as they did in the company that they created. So the SME path is typically is one path. The other thing that I've gotten much more emboldened around, because I've learned this the hard way, and I've honestly made a couple of mistakes around this, is when there is a false belief that these people want to stay. There's sometimes like smoke and mirrors around really what people want. So I will work with these founders and be like, are you really signing up for this next phase? Oftentimes there's like a lockup period in terms of like the equity and when a company gets bought out, like there's, mechanics behind that. But once that period is over, it's really having an honest conversation with them. Do you want to be here? Are you signing up for this? Because if they're just looking for the power, prestige, and status, they will drag the company down. And I have learned this the hard way. I've often in the past, I've made the mistake of trying to make everyone happy and trying to make it all work. But that was the wrong move.
Yeah, that seems like a very, very challenging and complex situation to have to deal with. And sometimes you're right. Sometimes it's best for everyone if you don't stay, right? And so having that honest and open communication. Talk to us a little bit about your experience and how your training as a psychologist has helped you in these very complex situations, because I think this is very complex and very hard to handle.
Yeah, so I got a clinical degree. So my PhD is in mental health counseling. It's not a very popular doctorate. It's most closely analogous to like a clinical psych degree. But when I left JP Morgan, I didn't want a business degree at all. Like I didn't want to pursue organizational psychology because I had this 9-year stint at JP Morgan, and I had a good sense of frameworks and how systems operate and how to like think about how the individual impacts the team that impacts the org. Like I knew all of this
Right.
experientially, but what I didn't know was how to create lasting transformation. And clinical degrees, that is what the degree is. It's
Behavioral change. Yeah.
how do we create change that sticks? And my clients, the way that I construct my business is I'm with my clients for years. So the example of the M&A event I just gave you, I was there for 5 years for 30 hours a week.
Wow. It's like almost a full-time job.
It's almost a full-time job. I was an outside insider. That's the best way to describe it. So I'm not interested in coming in and diagnosing a problem and leaving and playing the armchair consultant. That is boring to me and often I think does a disservice to the client. I'm really interested in creating this transformation that sticks and making sure that we get the results that we set out to achieve in the first place. And that just takes time. So the clinical degree gave me a lot of tools, especially when it comes to the shifting the way people think, feel, and act. And I don't think I would have gotten that training in a different type of format. The clinical degree was the only way.
Yeah, I love that connection that you made, the think, feel, and act. I use that a lot of the time, your thoughts and your emotions impact your behavior and all that. So I love that connection there. I want to talk a little bit about your work in the tech industry because I'm a techie at technology, right? So tell us a little bit about your work with startups specifically. How are they different from other industries and how are they maybe the same?
Sure. So I would say startups are much more nimble and agile, and that is super helpful when it comes to creating transformation. Because I've done also work at like household names, like you would know all of these names. I don't think I should say them, but let's just like
Yeah,
big companies, right? And
fair.
it's just tough to get quick approval to roll out things and get some initiatives executed. Startups are the opposite. Really, at the end of the day, you just need buy-in from the founders and you need a budget. And oftentimes, founders are pretty used to the mentality of give trust to get trust, which means I don't have anyone breathing down my neck about how I operate and the type of things that I think should be prioritized. They're really looking to me as the expert. So
Yep.
startups are just more nimble in that way. Another big thing about startups is like they're competitive. So there's this big focus around urgency, tenacity, grit, and that's helpful for this work.
Yeah.
They want to see the results. I think at this point I've done a good job demonstrating that like this type of work, this human work takes time, but they are very tenacious and they want me to get my hands dirty really quick and they're not going to get in my way. And then the third thing is also just like a personality difference. So startups typically are a little more casual. Sometimes that could be problematic. We'll put it that way. But I fit in much better in more casual environments. I would say, like, looking back at JP Morgan, I was definitely like a cultural misfit in a lot of ways. I didn't like buy my suits at Saks, I bought them at Express, right? Like, I didn't have the look of a banker. It's fine. It's me. But certainly when it comes to startups, like, there's a lot more inclusivity, I think, around what does the culture fit, look, and feel like. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, and so we talked about culture earlier on, and here it comes up again in the culture of a startup. When we talk about a startup, you talked about especially the leaders being a little bit more flexible and a little bit more trusting. How does that impact them as they continue to grow? Because I know that you also do a lot of work in helping organizations scale, right? So going from like 100 to 1,000. So
Yeah.
how does that impact?
So great question. I think that the best founders that I've worked with are thoughtful but quick decision makers. So like agility and flexibility is pretty critical because when you're moving away from that scrappy startup identity into that scale up phase, there's a
Yeah.
lot of change that typically happens. One of the biggest areas of change is often who is your leadership team. Sometimes people can grow into the roles that take the company to the next level. Oftentimes they cannot. And that is emotionally very painful because these people were the folks that were diehards and ride or dies and loyal and helped
Yeah.
get you to where you are, but they may not have the experience or the capability to get you to the next phase. So that transition's typically very hard, but the founders that I work with that are the best, they know this inherently and they're prepared for it. And sometimes it doesn't even mean exiting these people out of the org. It oftentimes does mean a redefining of the role that they previously had. So that's just one thing, but there's a lot of change that happens in that startup to scale up phase, that being one of them. I could speak to many more areas, but people change.
Yeah, it sounds so interesting to me, especially when you talk about the ride or die mentality when someone comes in, they're helping to build the organization and then figuring out that what got me here isn't going to get the organization where it needs to get to. And so as a leader, trying to manage those relationships. I'm wondering what you've seen in terms of leaders who are able to help the SMEs still feel like they're part of the organization and still feel valued, but also help them understand that maybe a different leader might be called for.
Yeah. So there's a couple different ways to think about that. If you're truly able to like latch on to the SME identity and make someone a subject matter expert, they and are able to really like educate the organization around their highest and best use, a lot of chips will naturally fall into place. The biggest area of friction is actually when you move someone who was previously running a department. So for instance, if I have someone who was previously, I have a situation right now. I have a co-founder who was previously running the customer success function, not going to be the person that takes that department to the next level. We moved him out of running that department into a SME role where he is much more external facing, very customer focused, branding, marketing, and he's no longer running the customer success team, and someone else who has done this at this size and stage before has come in. That is usually the biggest area of friction, is when you like pull a bunch of employees away from these folks and the function
Yeah.
they were running for so long. And you're like, actually, you ain't doing this anymore. Sorry.
Yeah. And that's tough with, I mean, we have loss of status when you're in the organization and things like that. You mentioned something that I think is really interesting. You mentioned co-founders, right? And a lot of organizations have co-founders. What's that? What's been your experience in terms of how to make sure or help them keep that relationship healthy? Because, friction can come up. And if it's not healthy, how do you help them to navigate that and maybe get to an equitable split, if there's such a thing in this situation?
Yeah. I'm laughing because like co-founder relationships are its own beast. It's like a whole podcast in of itself. But in terms of managing those relationships, so there's a couple like low bits of low hanging fruit. I often find that like co-founders are divide and conquer mentalities. That's wrong. So what I mean by that is like there's a certain element that's helpful, but there's other areas where that can become a roadblock. So you often see co-founders, one that's very focused on the tech side, so a CTO or CPO, and then the other founder is more focused on the business side, go-to-market functions, sales, marketing, CS. They often have this like divide and conquer mentality, but they often become very siloed. So a lot of times in those situations, a lot of times they deprioritize sharing information. And then if they're siloed, you better believe that the people below them and then the people below them, there's a cascading effect. So it could be something as simple as like you need to have meetings every week. So I have one company, they have lunch every Friday together for 2 hours. It's a small thing, not a big deal. The other thing that is helpful is when it comes to like big elephants in the room, how are they talking about them? So with another client of mine, we have a monthly meeting where we list all of the big things that no one really wants to talk about. We have a running doc and we set aside 2 hours where it's the three of us having that conversation. And I'm so spread out throughout that org. I already have like a ton of context. So I'm part like facilitator of that conversation, part challenger, and part like information sharer. So there's some of it's like low hanging fruit, and that's just around communicating more and communicating better. I've been through many situations where co-founders have exited the org, and that process is often tough and painful, but there are better and worse ways to do it. I would say like that actually doesn't really happen. I haven't experienced that often, only a handful of times.
Jena, I love the complexity of the role that you play and the work that you do. And we're just going to have you come back because we have barely scratched the surface. But how do people get a hold of you, get a hold of your services, or continue the conversation with you?
Sure. So you can find me at jenabooher.com. I'm on Instagram also at Jena Booher PhD. And feel free to reach out, send me a DM. We'd love to connect.
Great. Jena, I always want to ask the experts on the show, what's a tip that you have or something that you can share with the audience, to help, especially leaders, employees, in your case, M&A, what's a tip that you can share to help make their workplace better?
Sure. So, I mean, just because we talked a fair amount about mergers and acquisition, my tip is make sure that you prioritize cultural integration early on. Ideally, it's part of your due diligence process before the ink is dried on the contract. This is something I've lived through this that can either make or break these organizations. And also it's just so deeply felt by the employees. I feel this may be a bit of a stretch, but I think that there is an ethical responsibility you have to your people to make this a priority and to do right by them and to keep your eyes wide open around what does this actually mean for everyone involved and versus cleaning up a mess later on.
Yeah, I love what you said there. What does this mean for everyone involved, right? Really trying to consider everyone's perspective there and trying to be attuned to that. Jena, thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been fantastic. We're definitely going to have you come back. There's just so much more that I want to get into it.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks so much, Ernest. It's a pleasure.
Great. And to our audience, thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving us a review. We love feedback. Feedback is a gift, and we hope you will join us again next time.